All right, so today we're going to dive into some pretty controversial waters. We're tackling the question, is net zero a scam?
Hmm.
That whole idea of balancing out greenhouse gas emissions with removals to fight climate change. Well, there's a whole wave of skepticism building out there. Some people are even calling it a straight-up scam.
Hmm.
Get this essay here. It really digs into that argument. And honestly, it is pretty eyebrow-raising.
Yeah, it's definitely a provocative take, and it really shows how this whole debate goes way beyond just the science of climate change. We're talking geopolitics, economics, even a little bit of conspiracy theory here.
Okay, so for our listener who's maybe thinking, wait a minute, scam, what's that all about?
Yeah.
Let's set the stage here. Net zero. The idea is we reach a point where the greenhouse gases we're pumping into the atmosphere are balanced out by what we're taking out. Planting trees,
Yeah.
carbon capture technology, that sort of thing. Sounds good in theory.
Right.
But this essay argues that Western countries are basically getting played, tricked into adopting these policies while other parts of the world, especially those still hooked on fossil fuels, they just keep on chugging along.
Yeah, the main argument is that this push for net zero is actually a scheme orchestrated by foreign governments to give themselves an edge, an economic edge and a geopolitical one. They're supposedly funding think tanks and lobbying groups, maybe even messing with research, all to prop up this net zero story. And the goal, to weaken the West.
Okay, hold on. Before we get lost in the how, I gotta ask, why? Why would these foreign governments go through all this trouble? What's their end game?
Well, the essay lays out three main motives. First one is resource competition. Think about it. As the West shifts to renewable energy, the need for certain minerals, like lithium for batteries, goes through the roof. And guess who controls a lot of those resources? Not necessarily the countries pushing hardest for net zero.
So it's like a new spin on that old control the oil, control the world idea. Except now it's all about the minerals we need for the green energy revolution.
Exactly. The second motive they talk about is energy dominance. The essay argues that countries that stick with fossil fuels, especially with things like manufacturing, they'll have a big cost advantage. They can make things cheaper, which makes Western economies less competitive and could even lead to us being more dependent on imports.
So we end up hurting our own industries and making ourselves reliant on the very countries we're trying to outmaneuver. What's the third reason?
Strategic weakening. The essay claims that by forcing the West to adopt all these expensive climate regulations, while other countries just keep doing business as usual, these rivals can gain a leg up on the world stage. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy, potentially leading to a decline in Western influence.
Okay, so we've got the alleged motive. But is there any actual evidence to back up this claim that net zero is some kind of deliberate scam, or is this more of a connect the dots theory?
Well, the essay does lay out some specific arguments, 4 of them actually. The first one focuses on the economic burdens of switching to renewables. It highlights how these policies can drive up energy prices, which impacts everything from household budgets to the competitiveness of energy-intensive industries. Think about the steel industry, for example. If European steel producers are hit with higher energy costs because of carbon taxes and regulations, they might struggle to compete with producers in countries with looser environmental rules.
So it's not just some abstract economic theory. It's about real-world impacts on jobs, industries, and people's livelihoods. What's the next argument?
The second one is about offshoring emissions, or what they call carbon leakage. The essay is saying that while Western countries might be congratulating themselves for cutting emissions, they're really just shifting the problem somewhere else by importing goods from countries with lower environmental standards. So we might see emissions go down on paper, but the overall effect on the planet could be zero, or even worse, if those emissions are just being produced somewhere else.
It's like squeezing a balloon. The air doesn't disappear. It just moves to another part of the balloon.
Yeah.
So are we just kidding ourselves with this whole net zero thing? What's the third argument?
The third one focuses on carbon offsets. You know those programs where you can supposedly make up for your emissions by investing in things like planting trees? This essay is super skeptical of those offsets, claiming that a lot of them are full of problems. Some projects might not actually be additional, meaning they would have happened anyway even without the offset funding. Others raise questions about how long that carbon stays locked up. What if those trees get cut down later or burned up in wildfires? Are we really achieving those long-term emissions reductions we're aiming for?
It's like buying those indulgences they had back in the Middle Ages, hoping to offset your sins. But with carbon offsets, you can't be sure if you're actually getting what you paid for, or if it's just a way for companies to make themselves look green without actually changing anything. That brings us to the fourth argument, right?
Yeah, and this one really gets to the heart of whether net zero policies are even working. The essay points out that even with all the promises and targets, global greenhouse gas emissions are still going up. If these policies are supposed to be the solution, shouldn't we be seeing some real results by now?
That's a pretty harsh criticism. It does make you wonder, if all this effort and expense isn't actually bending that emissions curve downwards, are we even on the right track? Now, I know we're focusing on this skeptical view, but to be fair, haven't there been some real wins in the West when it comes to renewables? And what about global cooperation? We can't solve this alone, can we?
You're right. We have to acknowledge the progress that's been made. There's no question that wind and solar power have grown a lot in many Western countries. And these technologies are getting more efficient and affordable all the time. But the essay's point is that even if we do hit net zero in the West, it won't be enough if the big emitters in other parts of the world aren't playing by the same rules. It's like trying to bail out a sinking boat while someone keeps poking holes in it.
So that carbon leakage problem we talked about becomes even more important in this context.
Hmm.
If we're just moving emissions around instead of actually reducing them globally, are we really tackling the root of climate change? And how do we even start to get that global cooperation when there are so many different interests and priorities at play?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll need to wrestle with as we keep exploring this whole net zero debate. Because if the critics are right, and net zero is actually leading us down a path of economic disadvantage and geopolitical weakness, then what are the alternatives? Are there other ways forward that can deal with climate change without putting our prosperity and security at risk?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll dig into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore the solutions the critics of net zero are proposing, from diversifying energy sources to embracing technological innovation and market-based approaches. Because even if we don't agree with this whole scam idea, it's important to understand the concerns they're raising and to think about whether there might be a better way forward. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've laid out this whole net zero scam narrative, but let's switch gears for a bit and look at the alternatives they're putting forward. If net zero isn't the answer, then what is?
Well, the essay argues that instead of just trying to get rid of fossil fuels completely, we should be thinking about a more diverse energy mix. And one of the things they highlight is natural gas.
Natural gas, often called a bridge fuel, right? Cleaner than coal, but still a fossil fuel. So how does that fit in with this push for decarbonization?
People who support natural gas say it can be really important in moving away from coal. It burns cleaner, so it makes a lot less CO2. And it can provide that steady baseload power, which helps to stabilize the grid as we bring in more renewable sources, like wind and solar, which can be a bit unpredictable.
So it's like a stepping stone, a way to lower emissions now while we're working towards a cleaner energy future.
Yeah.
But what about the environmental worries about natural gas, like methane leaks? Aren't those a big contributor to climate change?
Oh, absolutely. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and leaks from producing and transporting natural gas can cancel out some of the climate benefits. That's why the essay stresses the importance of carbon capture utilization and storage, or CCUS for short, as a way to deal with those concerns.
Okay, CCUS. Break that down for us. What exactly does it involve, and how does it help make natural gas a cleaner option?
CCUS is basically a bunch of technologies that are designed to grab carbon dioxide emissions from different places, like power plants and factories, and it stops them from getting into the atmosphere. There are different ways to capture the CO2. Some are more advanced than others, but the main idea is to separate the CO2 from other gases in the exhaust.
So we're trapping the CO2 before it escapes into the air. But then what? What do we do with it?
There are a few options. One is geological storage. Basically, you inject the captured CO2 deep underground into rock formations that can hold it, and that traps it for a long time. Another option is to use the CO2. They call it utilization. You can use it in some industrial processes, like helping to get more oil out of the ground, or even making new stuff, like synthetic fuels or building materials.
Okay, so we're either burying our carbon or finding ways to recycle it. Sounds promising. But is this CCUS technology really ready for the big leagues? Is it cost-effective, and can we use it on a large scale?
That's where things get a little tricky. CCUS technologies are still pretty expensive, and there are some technical hurdles with both capture and storage. But there have been some successful pilot projects, and people who are into CCUS say that with more investment and innovation, it could be a game changer not just for natural gas power plants, but for a whole bunch of industrial processes that are hard to electrify.
So it's not a magic bullet, but it could be a really important tool as we try to tackle climate change. Now, you mentioned a diverse energy mix and natural gas with CCUS is one part of that. What are some of the other options being considered?
Well, the essay also talks about nuclear power. especially the newer advanced nuclear technologies, as a real alternative to fossil fuels.
Unclear. That's
Mhm.
always a controversial topic, isn't it? People tend to have strong feelings about nuclear power,
Mhm.
often because of safety concerns and the issue of nuclear waste.
Yeah, nuclear power has definitely had its share of problems and controversies over the years. But the essay's point is that we need to move past those old concerns and look at the potential of these newer, more advanced nuclear technologies, like small modular reactors or SMRs, and Generation the V reactor.
So not your typical nuclear power plant. What makes these new technologies different?
SMRs are a lot smaller than the traditional reactors, which makes them more adaptable and potentially cheaper to build. You can even build them in factories and ship them to the site, which makes construction simpler and cuts down on costs. Generation the V reactors are still in the research and development phase, but they offer even better safety features, more efficiency, and they produce less waste.
Okay, smaller, safer, potentially cheaper. But what about the waste issue? Isn't that still a big problem with nuclear power no matter what technology you use?
Nuclear waste is definitely something we need to deal with, but it's important to keep things in perspective. The amount of high-level radioactive waste from nuclear power plants is actually pretty small compared to other industrial waste, and there's a lot of research going on to develop better recycling technologies, and even new types of reactors that make a lot less waste, or can even use the existing waste as fuel.
Interesting. So nuclear is back on the table, at least according to this essay. But it's not just about bringing back an old technology. It's about embracing innovation and exploring these new, potentially groundbreaking advancements. What other innovative solutions are they pushing for?
The essay really emphasizes how important it is to invest in all sorts of research and development, not just in nuclear, but in things like grid upgrades, hydrogen, and other new technologies that are emerging.
Okay, let's break those down. Grid upgrades, that seems pretty straightforward. We need a stronger, more flexible grid to handle the increasing electrification of our economy and to be able to bring in more renewable energy sources. But what about hydrogen? That seems to be getting a lot of attention these days as a potential clean fuel source.
Hydrogen has the potential to be a big player in decarbonizing sectors that are hard to electrify, like heavy-duty transportation, shipping, and certain industrial processes. You can use it as fuel for fuel cells, which produce electricity with zero emissions, or you can burn it directly, like natural gas.
Sounds promising.
Yeah.
But isn't there a downside? I've heard that making hydrogen can take a lot of energy. And if that energy comes from fossil fuels, doesn't that defeat the purpose?
Yeah, that's a valid point. There are different ways to produce hydrogen. And the cleanest methods, they call them green or blue hydrogen, use renewable energy or fossil fuels with carbon capture. Those methods are more expensive right now than the traditional way of making hydrogen, which relies on fossil fuels without capturing the carbon. But as renewables get cheaper and CCUS technologies get better, green and blue hydrogen are becoming more and more realistic options.
So it's all about cost and being able to scale it up. But the potential is there, and it seems like a technology worth investing in. Now, what about those other emerging technologies you mentioned? Anything on the horizon that you're particularly excited about?
There's a ton of interesting research happening in all sorts of fields, from advanced geothermal energy, which could tap into the huge amount of heat we have beneath the Earth's surface, to fusion power, which could give us a near limitless source of clean energy.
Fusion power. That sounds like something out of science fiction. Harnessing the power of the stars. Is that even possible?
Fusion power has always been seen as the holy grail of clean energy. And yeah, it's still facing some big technical challenges, but there have been some exciting breakthroughs in recent years. It's a long shot, but if we can figure it out, it could totally transform the energy landscape.
Okay, so we've got a lot of potential solutions here, from natural gas with CCUS to advanced nuclear hydrogen and even fusion power. But it sounds like a lot of these technologies are still in their early stages, and there are some big hurdles in terms of cost and scaling them up.
That's true, but what the essay is saying is that we need to be investing in a whole range of solutions, not just putting all our chips on net zero, especially if net zero is leading us towards economic problems and making us vulnerable on the world stage.
So it's about hedging our bets, diversifying our energy portfolio, and encouraging innovation across a lot of different technologies. But technology is only one piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
What about policy? What kind of policy approach do these critics of net zero want to see?
Well, they're arguing for a more market-based approach, one that creates a level playing field where different energy sources can compete fairly, based on their real costs, including their environmental impact. One policy that comes up a lot in this context is a carbon tax.
A carbon tax, the idea of putting a price on pollution. Tell us more about how that would actually work.
Basically, a carbon tax would make it more expensive to emit greenhouse gases. This would create a financial incentive for companies and people to lower their emissions and to invest in cleaner technologies. The idea is to let the market figure out how to drive innovation and decarbonization, instead of relying on the government to tell everyone what to do.
So it's about making pollution more expensive and letting the market sort things out and guide us towards a cleaner energy future. But wouldn't that mean higher prices for consumers? And wouldn't it hit lower-income households the hardest?
Those are good points. People who like the idea of a carbon tax say that the money the government gets from the tax could be used to help offset those impacts. For example, by cutting taxes for lower-income families or giving them rebates. They also point out that a carbon tax would send a clear signal to the market, encouraging investment in cleaner technologies. And that would hopefully drive down the cost of those technologies over time.
So it's about finding that right balance, setting the price at the right level, and making sure the policy is designed in a way that's good for the environment and fair to everyone. But even if we get the policy right, there's still the issue of global cooperation. Like we said before, even if the West hits net zero, it won't matter much if other big emitters aren't doing the same thing. How do we bridge that gap?
That's probably the toughest challenge of all. The essay doesn't really give any easy answers, but it does emphasize the need for a more nuanced and practical approach to international climate talks. It suggests that instead of trying to force countries to accept targets and regulations, we should focus on creating frameworks that encourage cooperation technology transfer and helping countries develop their own capabilities.
So more carrot, less stick. But how do we make sure those incentives are strong enough to get countries to take real action?
That's where it gets tricky. It takes building trust, finding common ground, and understanding that different countries are starting from different places, with different resources and abilities. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, so we've looked at a bunch of alternatives to net zero, from diversifying our energy sources to embracing new technologies and taking a market-based approach. But like you said, there are no easy answers, and the road ahead is full of challenges. Where do we go from here?
I think the first step is to realize that this is a complicated issue with no simple solutions. We need to get past these polarized debates and have a more nuanced and constructive conversation. One that acknowledges the trade-offs and tries to find solutions that work for both people and the planet.
Okay, so we spent all this time unpacking this net zero scam narrative, looking at the arguments for and against it, and to think about some other ways to approach this whole thing. But I want to go back to that word scam for a minute. Does this essay actually give us solid proof that there's some kind of deliberate plan to sabotage the West?
Well, it's important to make a distinction between raising valid concerns and claiming there's some big conspiracy going on. The essay does point out some potential risks and unintended consequences of net zero policies, which is good for getting people to think critically and have a discussion about it, but doesn't really offer hard evidence that foreign governments are intentionally trying to deceive or harm anyone.
So maybe scam is a bit too strong of a word. It's more about highlighting potential problems and suggesting we take a more cautious and balanced approach.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment. The essay's strong point is that it makes us question our assumptions. It makes us think about whether net zero, as it's being done right now, is really the best and fairest way to move forward.
Which is a good thing to do with any policy, right? To always be looking at it closely, testing its assumptions, and being open to changing course if we need to.
Exactly. Blindly believing in any one solution, even one that's as widely accepted as net zero, can be risky. We need to be willing to have open and honest discussions, to consider different points of view, and to be open to adjusting our approach based on what we learn and how things change.
Okay, so let's put aside the whole scam label for now and focus on those potential problems. Even if nobody's trying to pull a fast one, are there still legitimate concerns about how net zero is being put into practice?
Definitely. The essay makes some good points about the risk of carbon leakage, where emissions just get shifted to countries with weaker environmental rules. It also criticizes the focus on carbon offsets, saying that a lot of those schemes aren't very transparent or accountable, which makes people doubt whether they're really working. And it highlights how some industries that use a lot of energy and some vulnerable populations could face economic hardship if the transition isn't managed carefully.
And these are worries we should take seriously, right?
Exactly.
We can't just brush them off as complaints from climate deniers or people who just want to protect their own interests.
Right. The goal should be to make this shift to a cleaner energy future. in a way that's fair and sustainable. That means minimizing the negative impacts and making the most of the benefits. And that takes careful planning, thoughtful policy design, and a real commitment to addressing the concerns of people who might be hit harder by the changes.
So it's not just about cutting emissions no matter what. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone, both in terms of the economy and the environment. Now let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say these critics of net zero are right, and we keep going down this path without listening to their warnings. What's the worst that could happen according to them?
The essay paints a pretty grim picture, where Western economies become less and less competitive, leading to job losses, lower living standards, and a shift in global power. It suggests that countries that haven't adopted net zero, especially those with lots of fossil fuels, could end up with an economic and geopolitical advantage, while the West struggles with the burden of its own climate policies.
That's a pretty sobering thought. And even though we can't predict the future for sure, it does show how important it is to think about potential risks and unintended consequences.
Yeah, exactly. The point isn't to scare people, but to encourage a more comprehensive and strategic approach to climate action. We can't just think about cutting emissions. We also have to think about staying economically competitive, making sure we have reliable energy, and creating a world that's fairer for everyone.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where our climate goals line up with economic prosperity and social well-being. It's about understanding that this is a complex issue with many different facets, and it needs solutions that are just as complex.
Exactly right. There's no magic bullet, no single policy or technology that's going to solve the climate crisis overnight. It's going to take a combination of things: technological innovation, policy changes, and people changing their behavior, all guided by a commitment to working together and a shared vision of a sustainable future.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do we hope they'll remember from our exploration of this net zero scam idea?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this whole net zero debate is a lot more complicated and nuanced than it's often made out to be. There are valid concerns on both sides, and it's important to engage with those concerns thoughtfully and respectfully.
We need to move past these oversimplified arguments, where it's just good guys versus bad guys, and embrace the complexity of this challenge.
Exactly. We also have to realize that there's no one perfect solution, no magic fix. We need to use a bunch of different strategies, from diversifying our energy sources to investing in new technologies and finding ways to cooperate globally.
And we need to be honest about the trade-offs, acknowledging that any shift to a cleaner energy future is going to come with some costs and challenges.
Absolutely. But we can't forget that doing nothing isn't an option either. The longer we wait, the harder and more expensive it's going to be to deal with the climate crisis.
So it's a call to action, a call to get involved and be informed, and a call to hold on to hope and optimism that we can actually rise to this challenge and create a future where both people and the planet can thrive.
Perfectly put. It's about finding that balance between urgency and being practical, between being ambitious and being realistic. It's about understanding that this is a journey, not a destination, and that we'll need to adapt and learn as we go.
And on that note of cautious optimism and a call to keep exploring, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the net zero debate. We encourage you, our listener, to keep asking questions, learning, and joining in these important conversations, because the future of our planet and our economies depends on it. Until next time, happy diving.